Hello, welcome to Module 4, The Importance of Trauma Stewardship. In her book, Trauma and Recovery, Dr. Judith Ehrman states that trauma is contagious. What she is referring to is the concept of vicarious trauma, which can impact anyone who listens to the traumatic stories of others or works alongside those who have experienced great trauma. Module 4 is designed to provide a general overview of the concept of vicarious trauma and its impact on the service providers. The foundational message is that we cannot help others at our own expense. That is not a sustainable or healthy approach to the helping relationship. Taking adequate time to discuss a self-care plan sends the message to us that this is something to be taken seriously. The objectives for this module are: first, participants are able to articulate the concept of vicarious trauma and how it applies to your work. Second, participants are able to identify symptoms of vicarious trauma. Third, participants are able to articulate strategies for effective self-care in how they work with survivors. Session 4.1, Understanding Trauma Stewardship. Working with survivors undoubtedly has an impact on service providers. The traumatic experience of survivors changes as we listen to their stories and experience compassion. Compassion is not merely pity. It is a costly involvement in the life of a survivor. A way we can think about this cause is in terms of trauma stewardship. So what is trauma stewardship? Trauma stewardship refers to the way we came to do the work of engaging with survivors of trauma, understanding how that work impacts us, and the process of making sense of and learning from our experiences. In using the word stewardship, we're talking about taking good care of something that has been entrusted to us. We remember that as service providers to the survivors of trauma, we are entrusted with their stories. Not just their stories, but their lives and their journey towards healing. We remember the privilege and sacredness of the work we've chosen to do. So what makes trauma stewardship difficult? Part of what is difficult about trauma stewardship is the toll that trauma can take on us, especially us as a service providers. This is sometimes referred to as a number of things. So let's define some terms. First is vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma refers to the process of change that happens because you care about other people who have been hurt and feel committed or responsible to help them. Over time, this process can lead to changes in your psychological, physical, and spiritual well-being. Because of the vast impact of trauma exposure, the impact is not solely on us as service providers, but also on those close to us, like our family, our friends, our colleagues, and the survivors themselves. This is why it is critical to be aware of it and how it can impact our lives. Vicarious trauma is not typically the result of one or two survivors with whom you're working. It is generally a process that happens over time and builds up. As we empathize with the survivors, we share in their pain and in their joy. And in turn, this has an impact on many different parts or areas of our lives. Consider these different areas for a few minutes. Please, like for example, changes in beliefs about the world, your spirituality, The sense of self, your emotional stability changes. The sense of personal safety, or not just your personal safety, but the safety of your family. Um, the trust of yourself and others. The way you judge other people. How about making sense of control? And ability to be alone or be with others. And lastly, your relationship to your body. To steward trauma well, it is important to be aware of our level of vicarious trauma or trauma exposure response. Here are some warning signs that we as service providers should be mindful of as we consider our personal responses to the trauma we encounter when we work with survivors. Okay, so I think there are 16. Okay, so there are 16 warning signs. So first, the feeling helpless and hopeless. This refers to the difficulty maintaining hope in the midst of seeing so much pain. For example, wondering why am I even getting out of bed in the morning? No? Individual holds themselves responsible for a situation when no one could reasonably be expected to master it. Individuals perceive the traumatic event will be long-lived. Okay? And some individuals believe that they are likely to repeat their current struggles. Okay, so that's number one. Second is a sense that one can never do enough. Okay? It is something like an internalized oppression, a feeling of inadequacy to meet the vast need that we are exposed to in working with survivors of trauma. Let's take, for example, sensing that you have to work long hours, an extra day, to do more because you're not doing enough already. Okay, I think most of us are guilty with this, right? Third is hypervigilance or being that high alert. No? Remaining on high alert at all times as a means of anticipating any potential dangers. You're always on the go. For example, seeing high levels of danger for your child, going to a relatively safe public playground, a wholly focus on your job, focusing on anything else seems impossible. It seems that you're always on the go, always alert. Next is decreased creativity. The deeper we sink into a culture of trauma, the less flexible and original our thinking becomes. And here, creativity requires embracing a certain amount of chaos, demands some leaps of faith. Decreased creativity can be a feeling of uh, joylessness, being bored, and only able to think inside the box. Fifth is inability to accept complexity. Having that clear signs of good and bad, right and wrong, needing to take sides, no, need to be certain, choosing side quickly in an argument rather than looking a whole situation clearly. Let's take for example, making a statement that you love the auntie of one survivor or one tita of a survivor, but hate the mother, demonstrating that you're unwilling to look at the complexity of the family dynamics, recognizing that all people have strengths and their own challenges. Six is minimizing. Here, making small a situation by comparing it with a far worse off situation. We tend to downplay anything that isn't as extreme as the very worst stories you've heard. Let's take, for example, being willing to hear about someone's bad day because the stories of survivors are so much worse. Next is chronic exhaustion or physical ailments. Bone tired, feeling soul tired, or heart tired. Somehow you can't remember the time you were not tired. Parang it's always a tiresome day. For example, consistently feeling too exhausted to do fun things outside work. It's a holiday, but you're doing things. You're doing your work, and you are very wary of optimism. Next is inability to listen or purposeful avoidance of supportive interactions. So here, you cannot take away any more information. Mind feels too full. Parang ang dami ng information. Overwhelming. Highlight of your workday is when you don't have to do your job. For example, you stop answering your phone in the evenings because you just don't want to talk to people, even if those people are positive and healthy supports. Okay? Next is dissociative moments. When people have overwhelming feelings, sometimes they check out and are unable to engage with another person. We sometimes tend to cut ourselves from our internal experience. We try to disconnect from what's happening. For example, no, when listening to a survivor tell her story, you might suddenly realize you haven't heard the last few sentences she spoke. So there's a sense of what's happening, a disorientation. Next is sense of persecution. A feeling that we don't have any control over our lives or over our choices. And we try to choose to remain powerless in the face of adversity. For example, when interpreting your survivor's genuine and legitimate attempts to help you correct your mistakes as nothing more than a disguised attempt to put you down. So, I think most of us are like this, especially if we're burned out. Next is guilt. Guilt is a feeling whenever you feel bad that we have not been hurt the same way others have been hurt. For example of this is feeling bad about celebrating Christmas with your family when you know there are survivors in the shelter who are unable to be with their family. Okay? So try to somehow look at yourself. No? Too am I too attached to this, to my work, or to my job? Next is fear. Fear. Fear is being afraid of intense feelings, increased sense of personal vulnerability, and worry about potential personal victimization. Next is anger and cynicism. Being mad, being pessimistic, you stop believing there is good in the world. You feel angry at injustice and ill treatment from family members, survivors we work with, and or our organization. For example, feeling deeply wrong by a survivor who treats you poorly, and in response, being unable to interact with her in a professional manner. You may also end up interrupting all of the survivors' moves as purposefully harmful to you. 13 is inability to empathize or numbing. Difficulty feeling anything in response to sad stories or happy stories. For example, coming home and immediately watching television to tune out, or feeling afraid to cry for fear or not being able to stop crying. 15 is addiction.
turn to whenever one turn to substances or the feeling of an adrenaline rush to keep us going. When addiction is also developing a tendency on something that helps you cope with the stress of work, be it substances or other bad habits like gambling. For example, drinking alcohol, no, that is one of the most common addictions. Drinking alcohol excessively to help numb emotions or create an escape from reality. Okay. Next is grandiosity, an inflated sense of importance related to one's work. When we see ourselves as primarily defined by our work, we have a hard time creating a good life or work boundaries. And I think most of us are like this because we are passionate to what we do. For example, no, you think of who will do this if I'm not here, and having an overinflated sense of responsibility. Okay? Okay. So just a recap, no? Um these are the warning signs of vicarious trauma. Have you noticed these warning signs of trauma exposure in your own life? No? So you can think of your own example in uh or you can think of your own personal experience, no, in the following. Okay? So for this session, session 4.1, these are the following key learning points. First, we learned today that vicarious trauma is the process of change that happens because you care about and other people who have been hurt and feel committed or responsible to help them. Over time, we learned that this process can lead to changes in your psychological, physical, and spiritual well-being. Second, we also learned that it is possible to remain healthy, even amidst the challenges of uh, working with and caring for survivors of trauma. This is part of trauma stewardship.